All right, so really happy to have Matthew Carlson here to speak to us today. Matthew's actually a coworker of Nick and mine at Industrial Logic. He's a senior consultant there. He's a developer, a trainer, a coach, a facilitator, and a public speaker. So a man of many hats. He has over 20 years of experience helping organizations improve really at every level, right down at the team level, all the way up to senior leadership. He's really fascinated by the intersection of software development, communication, and high-performing teams. And establishing trust is an important ingredient to developing high-performing teams. So really excited to hear what he has to say. So I will shut up and hand it over to Matthew to get started.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I didn't quite realize that I was sandwiched between James Shore and Woody Zoll, because those guys are amazing speakers. So yeah, no pressure. I'm going to share my screen here so that you guys can choose whether to look at just the screen over there, or me and get set up here a little bit. So addressing issues of trust. A little bit about me is the topic we're going to talk about here. Already got that great introduction from Anthony, and a little bit more about me and why I would be here talking about trust. Along with being a coach at Industrial Logic and having a background in development, it turns out I am also a trained social science researcher. I got to a point in my career where I was looking at a lot of stuff and realized that the problems weren't technical problems, they were people problems. And so I went back to school and found a real love of communication theory and ended up doing research. My first academic research questions were actually around measuring trust. So at a point in time when I came back to software and people talk about how hard it is to measure things in business, like value and those sorts of things, I giggle a little bit, and then we start looking at ways to do it. Because even concepts like trust are distinct constructs that in social science we gravitate to and find ways to talk about. So that's where a lot of this information comes from. So to start thinking, it jumped forward a little bit. There we go. Why do we even talk about trust? To get there for a minute. Trust is so fundamental to everything that we do in society. And something that I like to have people think about when we start this is think about just an everyday situation, a very simple everyday situation, like getting on an elevator, and start thinking about the different levels of trust and the different ways that you have to trust to do something as simple as ride an elevator. You have to trust the people who designed it. You have to trust the people who have done maintenance on it. You have to trust the other people in it. You have to do all of these different things just to step into an elevator. And so when we go beyond that and look at all of the different things that we have to do in society, from buying food to driving a car to anything that really relies on the work of others, trust is involved. It is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of society. That was actually the research questions that I was looking at, was in failing societies and failed societies, where are levels of trust? So I was looking at this at very high levels, and in recent years, I've looked at it at lower micro levels in teams and those sorts of things. So why do we care about this in a business setting? Well, we know that trust is needed anywhere work has interdependence. And we know that without it, we can't get anything done. And the more independent the work is, the more important trust is. So the promise of teams and the promise of Agile in general is high performance in a humane workspace. But how do we get that? And pretty much what research tells us is that we need three things to get to high performance. We need psychological safety, we need trust, and we need self-efficacy. Now, of those, you've probably heard of psychological safety a bit more these days. Trust is what we're talking about today. And self-efficacy is simply the belief that we have what it takes to succeed. That's kind of often taken for granted in teams, but really it also is an important thing to bring up when we're trying to help teams. So, okay, cool. Given that, what is trust? I'm going to start by saying what trust is not. Trust is not psychological safety. They are similar, they are very related, but they're not the same thing. So the difference is that psychological safety is a person's perception that an environment allows certain things. It allows taking risks, it allows making mistakes, it allows asking questions, it allows constructive disagreement, and it also allows raising problems. The first three are all about learning, that if you don't have these things, a perceived environment allows these things, then you can't have learning. And the other ones are about getting to better solutions. If you don't have those, and if you don't trust, I even use trust myself. If you don't have psychological safety in your environment to do these things, perceived safety, then you don't get to those. I bring that up just because trust and psychological safety get mixed a lot. And so now we can say, okay, this is about the environment. So trust is a little bit different. Trust is a person's perceptions of another's skills and knowledge, their follow through, and their good intentions. So if we go back to the elevator situation, I can trust that the people who built and maintained that elevator had the skills and knowledge to do it, that they had to follow through to actually do the maintenance and get it done, and that they had good intentions to keeping me safe and keeping everybody else who uses the elevator safe. But I can still not feel safe in the environment of an elevator, right? So this is how the concept of safety and trust differ. So we're going to focus in on just trust today. And we're going to talk about it. So, okay, cool. Other things about trust is that trust is incredibly contextual. Just because I trust my lawyer as a professional in a courtroom doesn't mean that I'm going to trust him to do open heart surgery on me. There are very distinct areas where I believe in this person's skills and knowledge, not just that they have skills and knowledge. Also, I share different information with my wife than I do with my colleagues, and that's okay. Trust, the depth of information that I have to share with, and the depth of trust that I have to have with the people that I'm working with doesn't have to involve things that are outside of what it takes to get the work done, and so those kind of contextual things. Now, there are interpersonal reasons to get to know each other and share those things and build things that way, but it doesn't have to be as deep, if that makes sense. So there are differences there. Also, we aggregate trust, but not necessarily fairly. A way to think about this is that if we don't trust an organization, it doesn't mean that we don't trust each individual who works for that organization, but we tend to treat it as a whole in the one bad apple spoils the bunch sort of thing, right? So just because, say, I had a bad experience with a particular organization doesn't mean I distrust absolutely everybody who works for that organization, right? However, I tend to think about them in an aggregate. And this gets important because there are kind of three perceptions with these things. There's the in, which is my internal, how am I perceiving this thing? There's the between, which is, okay, do we have trust between us? What's going on? And then there's the among, right? Am I among people that I trust? How are we interacting as a team? Those sorts of things. And those three different frames can be important and definitely come into play when we talk about trust. Often when people think about, oh, I can't trust this with that team, they're thinking about the team as an entity itself and the in-between, and not thinking about, or in the internal, and they're not thinking about the between or among of the individual people on that team. Is that making sense? Good. So here's a real kicker. To trust is to be vulnerable. As human animals, we are risk-averse creatures. When we talk about things, we use terms of phrase like to build trust. What that really means is help me feel less vulnerable. Help me feel the risk is worth it. And so trusting is an act of vulnerability. Why this is important. If you are in a situation where you are not willing to be vulnerable, there is nothing anyone else can do to build trust. It has to be a give and take. You have to trust enough to give them a chance to live up to or not your trust. So those tend to be important conversations with leaders and to help them expand how they're interacting with teams. And now I'm going to say something controversial. There is a controversial statement ahead here. Steel yourself for it. It is that we don't just want more trust. We don't want to trust con men like Bernie Madoff more. That would be a really poor choice. We don't want to trust blindly. That would be a really poor choice. What we want is more trustworthiness. And what we really need is parity between the two, right? So when we're dealing with these situations, it's not good enough to just say, okay, what we need on this team or in this organization is more trust. What we need is to have good conversations about how to match trust and trustworthiness. So, and especially in business, we really have to set ourselves up to be vulnerable, and we need to bias for trust. That is different from trusting blindly. That's different from just handing the keys of the car to whoever wants them and that sort of stuff. But it means that in a business sentence, we're not dealing with a random context, right? There have already been a number of gates that people have gone through to become part of the business, to become part of the team, all of those things. So we're already in a situation where we're interdependent to get the work done, and all of our success kind of depends on high parity between trust and trustworthiness. But the risk is actually usually larger in business that we trust too little, not too much. An example of this. So how many of you work on teams that use some kind of Git flow and PRs, pull requests? Right? I'm actually seeing some hands nodding, some hands up. If you think about the purpose of a PR, it's to keep bad code from making it to production. It's its entire purpose. And you hired professionals, right? I mean, that's why they're there. PRs make sense in a world where anyone can contribute to your code base. In the open source world, where literally any random person can pull down your repository, make a change, and contribute whatever they want into your repository, a PR makes sense to have that gatekeeper to test for trustworthiness. But a really important question is, what would it take for you to actually trust your developers to push code to production? Rather than, what kind of trustworthiness would they have to show that they have the clarity and competency to do this without a gatekeeping process or those sorts of things? These are questions that I ask teams all the time so that we can look at, okay, are we really putting barriers in front of people that test trustworthiness, or are we putting barriers in front of people that kind of we're just used to not trusting people? So that's why, bias for trust in a business thing can actually help us a lot. With all that being said, how do we address issues of trust? Again, we're going to look back at first, what does distrust look like? That's a useful thing for us to think about. So distrust, for me, very rarely does somebody come right out and say, I don't trust that team. I don't trust those people. I don't trust, this particular developer or that particular manager. So distrust has a tendency to instead come out through behaviors, and they look like things like micromanaging, information hoarding, people trying to control the information so that people can't use it against them, or those sorts of things, not giving important projects to a particular person or team, sending people to help the team. Quite often as a coach, I get sent into low trust environments because I'm the coach and I'm here to help. And that immediately signals to a team that, oh, wait, what was wrong with us to begin with? Right. So those can be signals that go on there. Demanding repeated status updates is a huge one in business. I see this all the time. It's like, oh, I don't trust that this is going to safely make it to our customers, so I want a red, yellow, green status meeting every day so that you tell me exactly where this is at so that we can raise any problems. Those happen often. Also, extra gates, checks, sign-ins. I'm sure you can all think of other behaviors in your work environment that actually show kind of a lack of trust. And so based off of research done in the 1960s by a psychologist named Griffin, he actually looked at trust and broke down what are the different dimensions when we're talking about trust. And it comes down to these three things, the ones that I mentioned earlier, that it's skills and knowledge, follow through, and good intentions. So if someone is saying that they don't trust a person or acting like they don't trust a person, something that I do is get curious and try and bring these different dimensions up so that we can figure out, okay, how do we work to make this better? I find that this improves conversations greatly, because if it's a skills and knowledge thing, we will attack that very, very differently than if it's a good intention, perception. So we'll just go through them and start with the first ones. The skills and knowledge. When perceptions of other people's skills and knowledge is the issue, we want to establish safety first by pulling back expectations and consequences to a safe level. This is a natural thing to do. This actually does look like often taking projects away or sending in help or doing those sorts of things, which is kind of the negative way to do it. I think about it more like when I was learning to drive a car, they didn't just put me in the driver's seat and throw me on the freeway. Instead, I was brought to a safe place. I sat behind the wheel of a car in an empty parking lot. And it was where if I made a mistake, there was very little danger to myself or others. In our day-to-day work, we need to find the right level of autonomy that matches safety with our skills and knowledge. And when we identify skills and knowledge gaps, we need to have safe places where we can improve them. So by creating an environment that allows us to safely learn, in software, we often do that with things like ensemble programming or pairing, learning good technical skills and practices through katas or those sorts of things, where we create an environment where people can learn and improve those skills, not just under great pressure. Now, the important thing about that is that as the skills and knowledge increase, then we also have to, as trustworthiness increases, then we also have to increase trust and autonomy. So a key point of this is that in order to gain trust from others and establish greater autonomy, we have to show competency. That's great. And then here's a key point for leaders. As people and teams show competency, leaders should give more control. It's a driving experience. And oftentimes, these are where I have conversations around trust with managers and people. It's like, okay, what would it take for you to feel comfortable with other people, having the autonomy to do that thing? Okay, can we make that explicit? Can we ask people to show us that they have the competency to do those things? And those tend to be very productive conversations. Follow through is another huge one. This is often actually where most people in business, if you say, I don't trust someone, automatically go. They assume skills and knowledge are fine. They assume good intentions are fine. And if you just say trust in a blanket way, people will automatically go to, oh, it's a follow-through problem. So follow-through, when follow-through is the issue, we establish safety by checking our agreements. This is really very important. It may be that one party didn't actually agree in the first place. I've literally seen situations, none of you have probably been here, but just go with me, where a manager goes to a meeting by themselves and in that meeting agrees that the entire team is going to get something done by a certain date, and then assigns that work to the team. And there's just an assumed agreement. I know that's never happened to you, right? But it turns out assignment is not agreement. there's not actually, the same understanding of what expectations are, and what goals are, and what's important, and those sorts of things. And if we were actually talking about contract law, there wouldn't be what's called a meeting of the minds. And often what I find with follow through is that it was actually that there was never an actual agreement. There was just an assumption of agreements. And so the first thing I ask people to do is to go back, check the agreements, make sure our agreements are visible. Find some way to say, if you do working agreements on your team, that's what these are. Because once you make agreements visible, that's when it's reasonable to hold each other accountable. Once there is an actual agreement. And high performance both requires high amounts of safety, but also high amounts of accountability, right? It's not just, oh, I have to be safe and comfortable. It's, oh, I have to be safe and comfortable and able to do this thing, and holding myself and each other accountable to high performance. So when that breaks down, the first place to go is to get curious about agreements, and really, really, really have conversations about how assignment does not equal agreement. That is a huge breaking point for that. Yeah, agreement actually means to have harmony of understanding and mutual expectations. And very rarely, if ever, do you get that with a simple assignment. So the last one that is a dimension of trust is good intent. So in general, we assume good intent in business. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, it's needed, but sometimes there are situations where we do feel like, oh, wait a second, that manager's not looking out for me, that they're not looking out for my team, or that person on my team isn't looking out for the rest of us. They're just in it for themselves, or those sorts of things. And when I start finding that that's the story that I'm telling myself in my head, that is immediately when I have to step back and check. Because in most situations, issues with trust around good intention can be solved by getting curious. Finding out what's important to that person and why their actions make sense from their perspective almost always changes this. When we run into teams that have gotten so many trust issues that they're at a situation of thinking that there is bad intent, what we often find is that you need to sort out priorities, that different people on the team and or maybe managers in the team or different managers above the team have conflicting priorities. And when you uncover those conflicting priorities, you can then realize that it's not so much a trust issue as oh, wait a second, I don't know which master to serve. I don't know which priority is higher, those sorts of things. And people make different assumptions that then comes across as a lack of good intent. Identifying competing goals. I worked with two partners in a business, and they had gotten to a point at an executive level where they were ready to split the business. They were just ready to dissolve it and walk away. And because they both thought that the other person had bad intentions toward them in the business. And after we had a conversation around their goals, it turns out that one of the founders really wanted his reason for doing this, his goal for making this business, was to create a lifestyle business for him and his friends so that they could have a reasonable lifestyle without a lot of pressure and a lot of, that they could go on skiing trips together, that they could basically fund happy, humane work. The other partner came into this business with the goal of making it a world-class business, that he wanted it to be the best they could possibly be. And they had never discussed those different goals when they created the business together. And it turns out that when the actions that made perfect sense to them from their frame came across to the other one as undermining. And as soon as we uncovered that they had competing goals for the business, then suddenly they were able to find, oh, wait a second, how can we meet both of those? How can we make it a world-class lifestyle business? And did much better together. And their employees were significantly more happy because there wasn't all of the extra stuff going on, all of those things. So that's definitely a good one to dig into. The last one is understanding different perceived risks. I have seen multiple times where especially developers will go off and implement something and go off this because they see a risk that other people don't see. And the other team takes that as, oh, you aren't helping the team, you aren't working on priorities, you aren't doing those sorts of things. It's like, really what should have happened there is a conversation to help everyone get on the same page of perceived risks and then figure out, okay, where do we need to go with this? So it wasn't people undermining each other's work. It wasn't people, going behind. It's just that they had different perceived stuff going on. So those are the ways that rather than just using the blanket term trust and breaking it down into its individual components tends to help me have better conversation with teams. Building trust and trustworthiness usually begins with understanding, at any point in time. Getting curious whenever you have these things starts that vulnerability process happening. It starts, the communication getting better and moving from there. So next steps with this information. Here's kind of the process of any of these sorts of things. You gather some knowledge, you start having some awareness of it, and then you model the change you want to see. So really, you're here, right? You just got some information. It's useful. What I would challenge everybody to do after this is to go and, when you're in situ, when you're in your business situations or your other life situations, and you see, some of the behaviors where you might perceive that there is a lack of trust, or you myself might find yourself finding that, hey, wait a second, they violated my expectations of their trustworthiness. To take a step back and think about these three different dimensions and ask yourself, well, which one do I think it is? Do I think it's a skills and knowledge or skills and ability, situation? Do I think it's a follow-through situation? Do I think it's a good intent situation? And then start asking yourself, well, how might we have a better conversation around that, and how might we go? And then, of course, once you're seeing them in the wild, then you get the opportunity to lead change. You get the opportunity to actually take a step back and ask the questions and model for other people how to have these better conversations. So that's what I've got for this one. I am perfectly happy to have, answer any questions about this, all that. Because I am an academic and grad school absolutely destroyed parts of my brain. My reference list is in this. We have references around psychological safety stuff, mostly from Amy Edmondson. I can give you the references to the trust work by Griffin from the 1960s, as well as how it's been used by Boatman Taylor and others who I got this from. And then also some stuff around teams and team dynamic stuff. So, oh yeah, and even more references and even more references and even more references. So, happy to send all that out. I went to graduate school, so you don't have to read the papers, but you certainly can if you want to. And I would love it if you check my work. So that's what I've got. Does anybody, what conversations do people want to have around this?
Matthew, I had one quick question.
Yeah.
First, thank you for putting this out. This is actually more than what I was hoping for, based off the title and your reputation. We worked together briefly. And so again, thank you. My question, there's a DevOps project or DevOps report, right, that comes out. I think it's put out by Puppet. Is there something similar for like teams and effective teams and things of that nature? I think they assumed, right, high functioning teams do all these stuffs, right, that have to do with producing software, but high trust teams can also have nothing to do with producing software.
Yep.
Is there anything out there like in the literature or that are like yearly or biannual reports that we could look at for that?
The best stuff that I could actually point you to for that is the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson on psychological safety. There's actually I'm going to answer it from the academic perspective. There is a validated 7-question instrument that teams can use to ask questions around the 4 key dimensions of psychological safety. And then in my work, there's based off of Griffin's work in the 1960s, there is another scan that you can do to measure trust in teams. And the way you use them is mostly to get, okay, what's the baseline? Where are we at? How do we compare ourselves to other high functioning teams? And then what are the dimensions that we think would be useful for us to work on? Now with trust, oftentimes I don't feel the need to run a full scan because it's 3 dimensions, and I can, kind of put those to a team, and then in their situations, we can actually just have the conversations around, oh, what's going on here? What would help us be better? And, if it's I have literally had teams tell me, I don't trust the product person, and it's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, I don't think they understand the domain well enough for us to really believe what they're telling us is the highest priority. It's like, oh, okay, can we check that? Can we actually have some good conversations about that? And since you obviously do know the domain very well, how can we help them understand it better?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. One quick follow-up. Are there leading indicators or quote unquote a metric that you could look at objectively, either within a team or across teams, to help you to understand, are they trending higher trust, higher accountability, or are they trending like lower trust, lower accountability?
I tend to look for behaviors. How many gates are there? How many, when I walk into an organization and I see that they have 5 pre-prod environments before anybody can push to prod, and they have to go through each of those gates, it's like, okay, what failed with the first 4 that you added a 5th?
Right. Okay. Right.
Yeah. Those sorts of things. So
I have PTSD from the amount of change control. Okay, so
exactly. Yeah, and change control is 100% about, hey, we have to absolutely make sure that we have trust that this thing is going to be safe to go out.
Slower is safer. I heard that phrase uttered once, which wasn't true.
Yeah.
Things still ended up not being safe. We just found out a lot later.
Yeah. So
great.
So yeah, I don't have a one size fits all answer. But like that list of behaviors I talk about tend to be they tend to be trailing indicators. Actually, the problem is that trust is an internal thing. It's an internal perception, and you're only ever going to get trailing indicators for those. right?
Interesting.
Because it's going to be how people interact based off of those internal perceptions.
Right. I guess maybe like a tell, right? When you're playing a wagering game, people have tells, whether it's good or bad. I guess if there's something like that in teams.
Yeah, that's kind of the list of behaviors that I put up there.
Great, thank you.
So Matt, I see your hand up.
Yeah, let me find my mute button. Sorry about that. I have a question for you. Have you noticed that since we have gone to a more virtual environment, that trust has sort of disintegrated a little bit? Because the previous company I was working for was a law firm, and I noticed when people were in the office, there was there wasn't the friction that there was with everybody going into a remote environment. And I just switched to a new company July of last year, and the team is all remote. And I've noticed that there's sort of the comfort level kind of goes 50-50 on trust on that one, where it was weird noticing the shift when I was at the law firm versus where I'm at now. I was just wondering what your observations have been as far as going into sort of the remote and the world that we're in now, and how that's impacted it, and how you fix that in a virtual world versus being able to pull everybody into a room and sort of have those exercises to kind of walk them through it.
Yep. So I can give you a research-based answer on that, because this is something that communication scholars have looked into for years. The keywords are actually computer-mediated communication. And when we look at computer-mediated communication, what we find is that you actually can build source credibility, which is often how trust is stated in the literature. You build source credibility and trust, but you do it slower. It often tends to take 3 to 4 times longer to build the same levels of source credibility and trust in a remote environment. Now, the interesting things about that are that it can get as strong, sometimes even stronger than in person. Thought behind that is that when we're doing computer-mediated communication, remote, those sorts of things, that we have much more control over our presentation and how we present ourselves and identity management. And therefore, if you think about, I don't know if you guys have that friend on Facebook who their life is absolutely perfect, and you only ever see the ski trip in Tahoe, and it's the Instagram world, right? They are managing their identity such that they're only showing what they want to show for this. Well, we all have that ability with remote. We get to curate who we are to the world. And there are positive things about that. There are some negative things about it too, but the positive thing is, if I'm an absolute troll and I eat fish in the microwave in the team room and, have my bag of popcorn and don't share and all of those things, you never know that about me in a remote world. But
I have interviewed for positions with sweatpants on.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the good side of it. The bad side of it is that some people can use that to over curate themselves, and they can be so guarded that they don't share as much with themselves, and they don't feel as comfortable, and that can really lengthen the amount of time that it takes to build that trust. So.
Yeah, I've kind of found that where you've got people where you can have the face-to-face and they'll turn the cameras on, it's great, because at least you can see those small tells, when you're talking to somebody, the people that are, the team members that I may have my own personal biases on this, but also I've noticed with team to team, if the people don't turn on cameras and they're just, it's just very standoffish, there is that personality equation that's taken out of it. So they can't, you don't know what that personality is. You can't see that online personality. And I know it causes a lot of people don't trust them. So I've worked really hard with teams to kind of make sure that either people aren't turning on cameras or there's more of that cross team sort of collaboration to kind of help break that down a little bit.
Yeah. Now, the good news about that is that we evolve communication based off of our setting. And so teams that don't turn on cameras or those sorts of things will still find ways to show emotion. Will still find ways to communicate those things. I mean, think about texting and emojis. You know, texting can actually be more emotive because it's explicit than cameras. Isn't that weird? Because
and I will tell you that a 13-year-old's interpretation of emojis is different than a 40-year-old interpretation of emojis.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a completely different ubiquitous language.
Yeah, we call this idiosyncratic communication, and teams will build idiosyncratic communication to expand on what they miss with the in-person, but it takes a long time to build that idiosyncratic communication.
Yeah, it kind of feels like the Slack world has turned into an Instagram or a Facebook feed or something else like that. So being the over 40 crowd, sometimes it's very hard for me to go, not be the old man and do the get off my lawn and, pick up the phone and call somebody. So
but there is reason for that also. When we think about it, again, going back to just pure communication research stuff, I mean, Claude Shannon, way back in the 40s, talking about the amount of information in any particular channel. So if we are face to face, your brain is processing everything that you hear in, any disturbances in the vibration that can make it to your ears, and it's filtering that stuff out to what you're attuned to. Your eyes are getting all of that input and filtering it in. So there's actually a really great test that you can do where there's a video of somebody saying ba, 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 va, va, va. And if you watch that video with your eyes open, you hear one of them. And if you watch it with your eyes closed, you hear the other. And what this is telling us is that based off of what you see, your brain at the speed of sound is filtering and changing your perception. So when we're in person, we have a huge amount of information that we're coming in through what we're feeling on our skin, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, all of that stuff. When you go to a video channel, video and audio, that cuts it down to what the bandwidth can handle. Smaller amounts, you're not seeing as many small ticks, those sorts of things. If you shut the video off, it's just an audio channel. If you take that and go to text, it's even less. And so the amount of information that we're taking in is significantly less. That does not mean that your brain isn't trying to fill in the gaps and trying to just assume emotion, intent, what's going on with the other person and around them, all of those things. So when there's a blank, your brain will just try and fill in the extra, right? And so what we have to do with computer mediated communication is check more often. Than we have to do in person. It's like, oh, this is the story I'm telling myself in my head. Is that actual reality for you?
True.
Matthew, are you using that phrase based off of a book?
What?
The story you're telling yourself?
I think I got that from Brene Brown.
Okay.
But
just making sure.
Yeah, it resonates with me really well because it's kind of how I've seen it work through research. We actually have these scripts that we have in our head that are what we're dealing with as far as perception, but it's perception, not reality. So we have to check it. Yeah. So I saw Alex, you've got your hand up.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. I felt like I was grinning ear to ear during your slide about how, assignment does not equal agreement. And I felt like almost like a therapeutic wave come across me hearing that. Like, I was thinking back to several points in the past month or so where it's like, hey, we didn't agree, you just kind of assigned. And now I feel like equipped to actually be able to speak to that. So that was great. The one point I was hoping you could kind of like expand on was the comparison you made between a team that should probably have some sort of inherent level of trust versus like a open source environment, and how PRs really like lend themselves well to one system versus the other. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not so much that a team, just that in a business setting, if we think about it, the point of business is, I hate quoting Milton Friedman, but I'll do it. The purpose of business is business, right? Where there is the money premise, is the way G. Paul Hill puts it. We are all here so that we can produce value for people that is valuable enough for them to actually pay us for it. And there are a lot of, that's a very distinct context that we're working in. And it's a context that, because there are so many gates, you have to be hired. You have to, be put on a team because at least one person believes you're a good fit on that team and have the skills needed to help them get the job done. All of those things, there's already been so much vetting before we ever get to a point where we're on a team in a business setting, that giving people the benefit of the doubt that they're there for the same reason you are. I mean, at least if it's explained, they're probably at least assuming, hey, I'm here to do good work, to produce good value, and to help this team get some stuff done. Very, very rarely do I meet someone who wakes up the morning and thinks, I'm going to screw them all. I will make it all crash and burn. In general, everyone is the hero of their own story. They're probably there the same reason you are, to produce value, get some internal validation out of their work, those sorts of things. And so because of that, because it's not a random context, then having the benefit of the doubt makes sense. However, in most business situations, I find the exact opposite is true, that people are so defensive about covering their butts, right? That they want to make sure that they're not the cause of the problem, that they don't trust anybody else to have good intent, skills, and follow through. And therefore, they have to make sure that it happens. And that can actually cause more distrust than it creates, or cause more distrust than problems and those sort of things than it would.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I guess like a follow-up to that, then, if one was on a team where it's a self-organizing team, so all of these gates have been passed when you hire. You bring in people that are trustworthiness, but still probably for some reason or the other, they still practice things like pull requests and some of these other things to establish trust. How do you initiate that change? Like, do you have any tips for initiating that change to take the step further into a more trustworthy like way of working?
The information that I just shared with you all, I generally will share with a team. It's okay, fine. So it seems like I'm seeing some behaviors that might be showing themselves as trust issues, those sorts of things. Trust is a really big word. We mean a lot of different stuff with it. So here, let me lay these out. And let's have a conversation about the behaviors that we're seeing and which of these might be, which of it might it fall into. And then we can have some good conversations around how we can match trust to trustworthiness. Because really what's going on is that when we have trust issues, we feel like our vulnerability has been violated. We trusted someone and we feel like they, for some reason, were not trustworthy enough for us to have done that, and therefore we will pull it back. And so really the conversation has to be about with teams, and in general, I try and say, okay, how can we make these a good match? Trust and trustworthiness. Where do you think there's a gap? And with leaders, I often try, and managers specifically, I often try to ask them to get out of their comfort zone. How can you live with a little bit more vulnerability than you really want to, and give them a chance to show that they'll live up to it? And explicitly tell them what you're doing. Make it very clear that you are trying to give space for people to live up to trustworthiness for these things, what's expected, that sort of stuff. And, that, because that's how we move toward autonomy in a safe way.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
The prime directive at the beginning of a retro reminds me a lot of what you were describing about, like, even if you've already read it or you have it memorized, saying it out loud, like at the beginning, I feel like, and if you do it genuinely, I really feel like it sets the tone. You can have retros without those that are forgettable. But ones where everyone, right, is vulnerable at the beginning, believes that statement to be true, contributes differently.
And so if you're not familiar with it, the thing that I said was a rephrase of, believe that people made the best choices they could given the context they were in and the knowledge they had at the time. Right. I've actually run into teams where I said that at the beginning of a retro and they said, I don't believe that's true.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, that's an awesome place to start. I don't trust that. I don't believe it's true. And therefore, let's talk about which part of that you don't trust. Well, I don't think this person actually lived up to their skills and ability. I don't think they actually had follow through when they could have. I don't think they actually had good intent toward the team when they were doing these things. Now, here's the thing. Most people won't do that with somebody in the room. And this is another place where being remote is great, because computer mediated communication allows people to, in different ways, have those conversations anonymously, which is significantly more safe. So, there are times where we can use the fact that we're remote to use the tools available for computer mediated communication to make conversations around trust, where people have to be vulnerable, safer for that through anonymity, through whatever. So does that help? Cool. So that's what I got. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to kind of share this work. And I obviously love talking about this stuff, meeting a bunch of you, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Where can we find more of kind of the things that you're working on in the public domain?
I write blogs at Industrial Logic. I'm on Twitter a good amount as M. Carlson SB. Those are where I drop most of my thoughts. By all means, feel free to email me, matthew@industriallogic.com. And I do my best to share. I got really lucky in that I took a different path to this than a lot of people through the communication research. And I really like sharing it because I find it incredibly helpful in my day-to-day life working with teams. And so would love to share it with other people also.
I do a lot of reading and a lot of looking over stuff. The type of information that you're providing is actually unique in the space, I believe. So I appreciate you taking the time to present today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Anybody else?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
How
Thank you.
I've got a quick question. I haven't actually, this is the first time I've given this particular version of this talk. It's usually part of a workshop, and there was a little blog I wrote on it. What time, how long, when did we start here?
About 10 after, maybe 13 after.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Since
probably about
we-
35, 40 minutes.
And we had some,
If you're
we
looking
had
for time, yeah.
a fair amount of questions there at the end too. So yeah, I would say around 30, at least I would say 30 for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I liked that there wasn't a rush to get the Q&A finished. There was a lot of slack in the presentation and the question format.
Cool.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for
Thanks, everybody.
organizing it too.
Have a
Thanks
good
everyone
night.
for coming.
All right, take care. Yeah. And join us
Bye.
again next month.
Bye.
See y'all.
Do not miss Woody.
Later.
He's a great speaker.
Yeah, he's really good.
Yeah, definitely.